Take this card, the stranger said quietly, holding out a sleek black rectangle that looked like it belonged in a billionaire's wallet, not in the cold hands of a homeless girl sitting on a damp subway bench. There is no limit. Use it however you want. Just do not lie to me about what you choose. Maya Collins stared at the card as if it were some kind of trick. In New York City, people did not hand out miracles to strangers. They stepped over you, avoided eye contact, and hurried past as though poverty might be contagious. Yet the man standing in front of her looked calm, almost curious, like someone observing an experiment instead of offering charity. The night air was sharp with the smell of rain and subway steam drifting up through the street grates. Maya pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders while taxis rushed by on Lexington Avenue, their headlights flashing across the wet pavement. She had been living on the streets for nearly a year, long enough to know that generosity from strangers usually came with strings attached. But this man did not ask for anything. He simply placed the black card into her hand and watched her with steady gray eyes. For a moment she wondered if it was fake, a prank, or maybe a hidden camera somewhere capturing her humiliation. The man noticed her hesitation and gave a faint smile. "You look like someone who understands hard choices," he said. "So, I want to see what choice you make." Then he stepped back into the glow of the streetlight, hands in the pockets of a tailored coat that probably cost more than everything Maya owned. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Maya sat there for several seconds after the man walked away, the card resting in her palm like a piece of forbidden treasure. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her that the last thing she had eaten that day was half a sandwich from a shelter line earlier that afternoon. With a card like this, she could check into a warm hotel, order a real meal, maybe even buy new clothes. The possibilities spun through her mind faster than the subway train roaring beneath her feet. Yet something about the stranger's words echoed. In her thoughts, "I want to see what choice you make." She turned the card over slowly. It was heavy, made of black metal, with no numbers printed on the front. Only a name engraved in silver letters. Alexander Hayes. Maya frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar, like something she might have seen on a billboard or a news headline. But she could not place it. Across the street, an older man she recognized from the nearby shelter was coughing into his hands while sitting against the wall of a closed pharmacy. Two other homeless women were arguing quietly over a blanket. Life on this block was always the same cycle of cold nights, hunger, and invisible people trying to survive one more day. Maya slipped the card into her coat pocket and stood up slowly, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly night air. If the card was real, it could change everything. But the question lingering in her heart was far heavier than the card itself. If someone suddenly gave you unlimited power to spend money, would you save yourself first, or would you remember everyone else still freezing on the street? Maya Collins walked slowly along the sidewalk with the black card resting in the pocket of her worn coat, the weight of it feeling strangely heavier with every step she took. The city around her moved with its usual restless energy as yellow taxis passed through puddles and late-night office workers hurried towards subway entrances, barely noticing the young woman who had been sleeping on the streets for nearly a year. The cold wind coming off the East River slipped through the thin fabric of her coat, reminding her that winter was not finished with New York City yet. Her stomach tightened again with hunger, and for a moment the thought flashed through her mind that she could simply walk into the nearest restaurant and order a hot meal. The card in her pocket could probably pay for a dinner that cost more than she had spent on food in an entire month. But Maya kept walking. She crossed 2 long blocks until the bright windows of a large grocery store came into view on the corner of 3rd Avenue. The automatic doors opened with a soft mechanical sound as she stepped inside, and the sudden warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. The smell of fresh bread and roasted chicken drifted through the aisles. For a moment Maya simply stood there, overwhelmed by the ordinary comfort of a place where people did not have to think about survival every hour of the day. She reached into her pocket and touched the card again, almost expecting it to disappear like a dream. The name engraved in silver letters still caught the light. Alexander Hayes. Whoever he was, he had given her a decision that felt far larger than money. Maya picked up a small shopping basket and began walking slowly through the store. At first, she moved past the ready meals and warm soups that would have satisfied her own hunger immediately. Instead, she stopped near the shelves filled with canned vegetables and bags of rice. She remembered the people sleeping in the underground parking structure 3 blocks away, where several homeless families had taken shelter from the winter cold. There was an older man named Victor who coughed through the night because he could not afford medicine. There was a young mother named Elena who spent her days trying to keep her small child warm with blankets donated by churches. Maya placed several bags of rice into the basket, then added canned beans, canned soup, bread, and large bottles of clean drinking water. She continued through the store with quiet determination, filling 2 shopping carts with food, warm socks, blankets, and basic medicine. Other shoppers glanced at her curiously but said nothing. At the checkout counter, the cashier stared in disbelief as the total on the screen climbed higher and higher. Maya slid the black card across the counter with a steady hand. The machine processed the payment without hesitation. Within minutes, store employees helped her carry the supplies outside, where they loaded everything into a small delivery van that serviced the neighborhood. Maya gave the driver an address that most people in the city pretended did not exist. Meanwhile, several miles away in a glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan, Alexander Hayes stood inside his private office watching the lights of the city flicker through the wide windows. A quiet notification appeared on the tablet in his hand as the first transaction from the black card was recorded. His assistant had connected the card to a secure monitoring system earlier that evening at his request. Alexander expected to see charges from luxury boutiques or expensive hotels. Instead, the list of purchases that appeared on the screen made him pause. Bags of rice, canned vegetables, blankets, medicine. He leaned slightly closer to the tablet, reading every line again as if the information might change. The total amount spent was already thousands of dollars, yet none of it had been used for personal comfort. Alexander felt an unfamiliar curiosity stir in his chest as he looked down at the name attached to the card transaction. Maya Collins. Outside his office window, the city continued its endless motion. But for the first time that night, Alexander Hayes wondered whether the quiet girl from the subway bench was about to prove that his understanding of people had been wrong all along. Maya Collins rode in the back of the small delivery van as it rolled slowly through the quiet streets of the Lower East Side. The driver, a middle-aged man named Carl who had agreed to help after hearing her explanation, glanced at her through the rearview mirror with mild curiosity. He had seen people buy large amounts of food before, but rarely someone who looked like she had slept outside the night before. Maya kept her hands folded in her lap, while the city lights passed across the windows in streaks of yellow and white. Inside the van, the boxes of food shifted gently with every turn. Bags of rice, canned soup, blankets, and medicine were stacked around her like fragile promises waiting to be delivered. When the van finally turned down a narrow alley beside an abandoned parking structure, Maya asked Carl to stop. The building looked like a forgotten skeleton of concrete and steel rising into the cold night sky. Most people avoided the place because it smelled faintly of damp pavement and old garbage. But for several homeless families, it had become the closest thing to shelter they could find. Maya stepped out of the van and began unloading the supplies one box at a time. The sound of footsteps echoed in the shadows as several people slowly emerged from deeper inside the structure. Victor was the first to recognize her. The older man, wrapped in a faded army jacket, coughed into his sleeve before speaking. "Maya, where did you get all this food?" Maya gave a small smile while handing him a blanket and a bottle of medicine for his cough. "A stranger gave me a chance tonight," she said quietly. "I thought we should all share it." More people gathered as the boxes were opened. Elena appeared carrying her small child wrapped carefully in a large scarf. Her eyes widened when she saw the stacks of food and warm supplies. Maya knelt down beside her and handed her a package of baby formula along with thick socks and a blanket. For the first time in days, the child laughed softly, clutching the edge of the blanket as if it were a new toy. The underground space slowly filled with quiet relief as people realized that tonight they would not go to sleep hungry. Maya helped organize the supplies, stacking food along one wall and passing out blankets to anyone who needed them. No one asked many questions. On the streets, people learned not to question small miracles too closely, because sometimes they disappeared just as quickly as they arrived. Nearly 40 minutes later, the last box had been emptied. The group gathered around a makeshift table built from wooden pallets while Maya poured hot soup into paper cups. The warm steam rose into the cold air like a fragile sign of comfort. Across the city in his office high above Midtown Manhattan, Alexander Hayes was still studying the transaction history appearing on his tablet. The list of purchases had grown longer with every passing minute. Food supplies, medical items, blankets. More items followed as the purchases were finalized and delivered. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression no longer amused but thoughtful. Most people who suddenly gained access to unlimited money revealed their true nature quickly. Some spent wildly on themselves. Others tried to hide the spending out of guilt. But the young woman named Maya Collins had done something entirely different. She had taken the opportunity and turned it outward instead of inward. Alexander tapped the screen again and opened the location data attached to the purchases. The delivery address appeared as an abandoned parking structure in the Lower East Side. His assistant Sophia Grant entered the office quietly a moment later carrying a folder of reports. She paused when she saw the expression on his face. Is something wrong? Alexander shook his head slowly while turning the tablet toward her. Look at the spending pattern on this card. Sophia scanned the list with raised eyebrows. That is unusual, she admitted. Most people would have checked into a luxury hotel within the first hour. Alexander stood and walked toward the tall window overlooking the city lights. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. For the first time since he had handed the black card to a stranger on a cold subway bench, he felt something he did not expect. Curiosity mixed with a quiet respect. He turned back toward Sophia and spoke calmly. Prepare the car. I want to see where this story is going. Maya Collins stayed inside the dim parking structure long after the food had been shared. The small group of people who had gathered there slowly settled into a rare moment of calm. Some sat on old folding chairs while others leaned against concrete pillars wrapped in blankets that were warmer than anything they had owned in months. The smell of soup and fresh bread drifted through the air, replacing the usual scent of cold metal and damp pavement. Maya watched quietly as Victor took his medicine with careful gratitude, and Elena tucked the new blanket more securely around her child. For a moment, the underground shelter felt almost peaceful. Maya sat down on an overturned crate and rubbed her tired hands together. She could still feel the weight of the black card inside her coat pocket. Even after buying all the food and supplies, there was still far more money available than she had ever seen in her life. A small voice in her mind reminded her that she could still leave this place, find a hotel room, and finally sleep in a real bed for the first time in nearly a year. But when she looked around at the people warming themselves with the supplies, that thought quietly faded. Several blocks away, a black luxury sedan rolled slowly down the same narrow street that led to the abandoned parking structure. Inside the car, Alexander Hayes sat in the back seat beside the window while the city lights slid across the glass. His assistant Sophia Grant sat across from him with the tablet still open to the list of purchases connected to the black card. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The quiet inside the car was filled only by the low hum of the engine and the distant sounds of traffic. Finally, Sophia looked up from the screen. I confirmed the delivery location, she said. It is an abandoned parking structure. According to city records, several homeless families have been using it as shelter during the winter. Alexander nodded slowly as he watched the building appear at the end of the street. The concrete structure looked worn and forgotten compared to the shining towers of Midtown, where he usually spent his time. He had built his career studying people and predicting their decisions in the world of finance. Investors were driven by profit. Competitors were driven by ambition. Very few actions surprised him anymore. Yet the quiet choices of a homeless woman with unlimited access to money had done exactly that. The driver stopped the car at the corner as instructed. Alexander stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold night air brushing against his face. He told the driver to wait while he walked the remaining distance alone. Sophia stayed inside the car, watching through the window with curiosity. As Alexander approached the entrance of the structure, he could hear voices echoing softly inside. They were not angry voices or desperate arguments like he expected. Instead, they sounded calm, almost grateful. He stepped carefully into the shadows near the entrance and paused. From where he stood, he could see Maya moving among the small group of people, passing out cups of soup and checking on each person as if she had been doing this for years. She knelt beside Victor to make sure he took his medicine and then helped Elena adjust the blanket around her child. No one there treated her like a stranger. They treated her like someone they trusted. Alexander remained silent in the darkness, watching the scene unfold in front of him. The young woman he had met on a subway bench was not spending his money to escape hardship. She was using it to protect others who were suffering beside her. For the first time in a very long time, Alexander Hayes felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was not pity, and it was not curiosity. It was respect. He stepped forward slowly into the dim light of the structure, his footsteps echoing softly across the concrete floor. Several people turned their heads in surprise as the well-dressed stranger appeared. Maya looked up as well, her eyes widening slightly when she recognized the man who had handed her the black card only hours earlier. The quiet shelter suddenly fell silent as everyone waited to see what he would say next. The echo of Alexander Hayes's footsteps across the cold concrete floor seemed to freeze the entire shelter in place. For a few seconds no one moved. The quiet warmth that had filled the underground space only moments earlier now felt fragile, like it might shatter with a single wrong word. Maya Collins slowly stood up from beside the small wooden table where she had been handing out cups of soup. Her hands were still warm from the steam rising from the pot, but her heart suddenly beat faster as she recognized the man standing a few feet away. The same calm expression rested on his face, the same composed posture of someone who belonged in a world very different from the one surrounding them. Maya slipped her hand into her coat pocket and felt the smooth edge of the black card. For a moment neither of them spoke. Victor glanced between them with confusion, while Elena gently rocked her child against her shoulder, sensing the tension that had entered the room. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. His voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I see you used the card." Maya lifted her chin slightly, meeting his eyes without fear. "Yes," she answered simply. Alexander looked around the shelter slowly, taking in every detail. The stacks of food neatly organized along the wall. The blankets wrapped around tired shoulders. The medicine placed carefully beside Victor. None of it looked like careless spending. It looked like thoughtful preparation. "You spent a lot of money tonight," Alexander said calmly. Maya nodded. "I know." The silence stretched again for a moment. Then Alexander asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he watched the transactions appear on his tablet. "Why did you not spend it on yourself?" The people around them waited quietly. Maya glanced at the group before answering. Her voice remained steady. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing." She gestured gently toward Victor and Elena and the others sitting nearby. "And I know what it feels like to be invisible. A hotel room would help me for one night. Food like this helps all of us for many nights." Alexander studied her expression carefully. There was no performance in her voice, no attempt to impress him. She was simply explaining a decision that felt obvious to her. Victor cleared his throat softly and spoke from his seat. "That young woman saved this place tonight," he said. "We have not eaten like this in weeks." Several others nodded quietly in agreement. Elena looked at Maya with grateful eyes. "My child will sleep warm tonight because of her." Alexander took a slow breath. In his world, decisions were measured by profit margins and strategic advantages. People rarely gave something away without expecting something in return. Yet the young woman standing in front of him had been handed unlimited spending power and chose to share it immediately. Maya reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the black card. She stepped forward and held it out toward him. "I think this belongs to you," she said. "I used more than enough already." The gesture caught Alexander off guard. Most people would have clung to the card as long as possible. Instead, Maya was giving it back without hesitation. He looked down at the card resting in her hand for a moment before slowly shaking his head. "Keep it," he said. Maya frowned slightly in confusion. "Why?" Alexander met her gaze again, and this time his voice carried a quiet sincerity that had not been there before. "Because you already proved something tonight." Maya tilted her head slightly. "What did I prove?" Alexander allowed himself a faint smile. "That money does not create character. It reveals it." The people inside the shelter exchanged curious glances while Maya lowered her hand slowly, still holding the black card. She had expected anger or suspicion from the stranger who had tested her. Instead, she was looking at a man who seemed genuinely impressed. After a moment, Alexander glanced around the shelter once more before speaking again. "Tell me something, Maya Collins. If you still have access to that card tomorrow morning, what would you do next?" The question Alexander Hayes asked hung quietly in the cold air of the parking structure. "If you still have access to that card tomorrow morning, what would you do next?" Everyone inside the shelter looked toward Maya Collins. The small group had grown used to surviving one day at a time, never thinking too far ahead, because tomorrow was usually uncertain. Maya lowered her eyes for a moment as she considered the question. She could still feel the smooth edge of the black card resting in her palm. For a brief moment, she imagined the obvious answer. She could rent apartments for everyone here. She could buy new clothes, warm beds, maybe even help people find work again. But she also understood something from living on the streets. Money could solve many problems, but it could also disappear quickly if it was not used carefully. Maya lifted her gaze again and looked directly at Alexander. Tomorrow morning, she said slowly, I would start by finding a real kitchen. The people around her looked slightly confused, but Alexander remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Maya gestured toward the empty soup pot sitting on the wooden table. Right now we are sharing food when we can find it, but that does not last long. If we had a place to cook every day, we could feed more people than just the ones sleeping here. Alexander watched her closely. Maya continued speaking with calm determination. There are empty buildings all over this neighborhood. If one of them could become a small kitchen and shelter, people would not have to hide in places like this. Victor nodded quietly from his seat. She is right, he said in a raspy voice. Food lines at the shelters are getting longer every winter. Elena gently adjusted the blanket around her child and spoke softly. Even one warm meal every day would change everything for many families. Maya did not sound excited as she spoke. Instead, she sounded practical, like someone solving a problem step by step. Alexander noticed that she never mentioned buying anything for herself. Not once. He folded his arms thoughtfully. And what would you do after that kitchen is built? He asked. Maya gave a small shrug. Then we help people find work again. Most of us here had jobs once. We just lost them faster than we could recover. The simple honesty of her answer filled the space with quiet understanding. Alexander felt a strange feeling growing in his chest. When he had handed her the card, he expected to confirm something he believed about human nature. He thought people revealed selfish instincts when given unlimited power. Instead, Maya was revealing something entirely different. She was thinking like someone responsible for a community rather than a single life. Alexander glanced around the shelter once more. The concrete walls were cracked. The lighting came from a few portable lamps plugged into an extension cord. The place was barely safe enough to stand in during the winter. Yet inside these cold walls, Maya had already created a small sense of order and dignity. He slowly stepped closer to the wooden table where the empty soup pot rested. Maya, he said quietly, do you know who I am? She shook her head honestly. No, I only know your name from the card. Alexander hesitated for a moment before answering. My name is Alexander Hayes. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Global Capital. Several people inside the shelter looked confused by the formal title, but Victor suddenly widened his eyes with recognition. That name appears on television sometimes, he murmured. Alexander ignored the attention and kept his eyes on Maya. The reason I gave you that card tonight was because I wanted to test something. Maya crossed her arms slightly. You wanted to see if a homeless girl would steal from you. Alexander nodded once. Something like that. Maya did not appear offended. Instead, she looked thoughtful. Then I hope you got your answer. Alexander gave a faint smile. I did. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small business card, handing it to her. Maya looked down at it carefully. The elegant letters printed across the surface read Alexander Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Global Capital. Maya looked back up at him with surprise slowly appearing on her face. Alexander continued speaking calmly. Tomorrow morning, I would like you to come to my office. There is something I want to discuss with you about that kitchen you mentioned. Maya stared at the card for a long moment. Around them, the quiet shelter waited to see what decision she would make next. The quiet inside the shelter lingered for several seconds after Alexander Hayes handed Maya Collins the small business card. The thin piece of paper looked strangely out of place in her rough hands, which still carried faint marks from months of surviving on the streets. The elegant black lettering seemed to belong to a completely different world. Maya read the name again slowly. Alexander Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Global Capital. She lifted her eyes and studied the man standing in front of her. He did not look different than he had earlier that night when he handed her the black card on the subway bench. Yet now the meaning of his calm confidence felt clearer. This was not just a wealthy stranger testing her with money. This was one of the most powerful business leaders in the country, standing inside a forgotten parking structure among people most of the city pretended did not exist. Victor leaned forward slightly from his seat and spoke in a quiet voice. Hayes Global Capital runs half the construction projects in this city, he said slowly. Maya blinked in surprise. She had seen the name before on signs attached to tall buildings under construction, but she never imagined meeting the man behind it while handing out soup in an underground shelter. Maya looked down at the card once more and then back at Alexander. You want me to come to your office tomorrow? She said carefully. Alexander nodded once. Yes. Maya glanced around the shelter as if trying to understand the situation. The people here depended on each other in simple ways. If she left for several hours the next day, it would not destroy their fragile community, but the idea still made her uneasy. She slipped the card into her coat pocket beside the black card and folded her arms. Why me? She asked quietly. Alexander took a moment before answering. Because you think differently than most people I meet, he said. Maya raised an eyebrow. Differently how? Alexander gestured toward the stacks of food and blankets surrounding them. Most people who suddenly gain access to unlimited money begin by solving their own problems first. You solved everyone else's problems first. Maya shrugged slightly. I solved the problems I could see. Alexander gave a faint nod of approval. That is exactly the difference. The small group inside the shelter listened silently to the conversation. Elena gently rocked her child while watching Maya with hopeful eyes. Victor leaned back against the concrete pillar and folded his arms. Maya remained quiet for several seconds, considering the invitation. Part of her felt suspicious. Life on the streets taught people to question sudden opportunities. But another part of her remembered the question Alexander had asked earlier about what she would do tomorrow. The idea of building a real kitchen and shelter had not left her mind. Finally she spoke. If I come to your office tomorrow, what exactly are you expecting from me? Alexander answered without hesitation. I want to hear your ideas. Maya frowned slightly. That is all. For now, yes. Maya looked down at her worn boots resting on the concrete floor. She imagined walking into a glass tower filled with polished floors and expensive suits. The thought felt almost absurd. I do not look like someone who belongs in a place like that, she said quietly. Alexander studied her for a moment and then replied in a calm voice. Maya Collins, the only thing I am interested in tomorrow is how your mind works, not how your shoes look. Victor let out a soft chuckle from his seat. That sounds fair to me, he said. Maya glanced at him and then back at Alexander. The serious expression on the businessman's face did not suggest a joke. Finally, Maya gave a slow nod. All right, she said. I will come. Alexander reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small folded piece of paper with an address printed on it. The building is on Madison Avenue. Ask for Sophia Grant at the reception desk. She will be expecting you. Maya accepted the paper carefully. Alexander turned toward the entrance of the structure, pausing briefly before leaving. When he looked back at her, his voice carried a quiet confidence. Maya, he said, tomorrow might be the beginning of something much bigger than a kitchen. With that, he stepped out into the cold New York night, leaving the shelter filled with curious silence and a young woman holding two cards that suddenly seemed capable of changing far more than her own life. The night after Alexander Hayes left the parking structure felt different from any night Maya Collins had experienced during her months on the street. The cold wind still moved through the broken concrete walls, and the same distant sounds of traffic echoed from the nearby avenues. Yet something inside Maya's mind refused to settle. She lay awake on a thin blanket near one of the concrete pillars, staring up at the dark ceiling above her. In her coat pocket, she could feel the edges of two small objects pressing against the fabric. One was the black card that had already changed the night for everyone inside the shelter. The other was the business card that carried the name Alexander Hayes and the address on Madison Avenue. Maya turned onto her side and listened to the quiet breathing of the people around her. Victor was already asleep, his coughing finally calmer after taking the medicine she had bought. Elena sat nearby, rocking her child gently until the little one drifted into sleep beneath the warm blanket. For a long time, Maya wondered if she should really go to that office in the morning. People with power did not usually invite strangers from the street into their world. Even if Alexander Hayes sounded sincere, she knew that entering his world might expose her to expectations she was not prepared for. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her into a shallow sleep, just before the first gray light of morning crept through the cracks of the parking structure. A few hours later, Maya woke to the sound of footsteps and quiet conversation as several people began preparing for the day. The city above them was already alive with commuters heading toward work. Maya sat up slowly and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. Victor noticed her and walked over with a small smile. "Are you really going to that office today?" he asked. Maya hesitated before answering. "I think I should at least hear what he wants to say." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "If that man can help turn your idea into something real, then you owe it to yourself to try." Elena joined them a moment later with her child wrapped carefully in the new blanket. "You helped all of us yesterday," she said softly. "Maybe today someone helps you build something bigger." Maya looked at both of them and felt a quiet determination settle inside her chest. She stood up and brushed the dust from her coat. Her clothes were still worn and faded, but they were clean enough. She reached into her pocket and touched the 2 cards again before walking toward the exit of the structure. The cold morning air greeted her as she stepped onto the street. A short bus ride and a long walk later, Maya found herself standing across the street from a tall glass tower that stretched high above Madison Avenue. The building reflected the bright morning sunlight like a mirror, making it almost impossible to see inside. People in expensive suits moved quickly through the revolving doors, while security guards stood near the entrance. Maya paused on the sidewalk, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked. She took a deep breath and walked forward anyway. Inside the lobby, everything was quiet and polished. The floor shone like glass, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and clean marble. Several people glanced at her with curiosity as she approached the reception desk. A young woman with dark hair looked up from her computer and offered a professional smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Maya reached into her pocket and placed the business card on the desk. "I am here to see Sophia Grant," she said. The receptionist read the name on the card, and her expression changed instantly. "One moment, please." She made a quick phone call before standing and gesturing toward the elevators. "Someone will come down to meet you." Maya waited quietly while the elevator doors opened a few moments later. A confident woman in a navy suit stepped out and walked directly toward her. Maya recognized her immediately as the assistant Alexander had mentioned. The woman extended her hand politely. "You must be Maya Collins. My name is Sophia Grant. Mr. Hayes is expecting you." Maya shook her hand carefully while looking around the enormous lobby once more. Everything about this place felt different from the cold shelter she had left behind only an hour earlier. Sophia noticed her hesitation and offered a reassuring smile. "Do not worry," she said gently. "Mr. Hayes rarely invites people here without a reason." As they stepped into the elevator together, Maya felt the quiet sense that her life was about to move into a world she had never imagined entering before. The elevator rose smoothly through the glass tower, carrying Maya Collins and Sophia Grant upward into a world that felt impossibly distant from the cold parking structure she had slept in only hours earlier. Maya stood quietly near the back of the elevator while watching the numbers above the door slowly increase. Each floor seemed to represent a different level of a life she had never imagined stepping into. Employees wearing polished suits entered and exited at different floors, some briefly glancing at Maya with quiet curiosity before continuing their conversations about meetings, investments, and schedules. Sophia noticed Maya's cautious expression and spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. "Mr. Hayes prefers to meet people privately before making any decisions," she explained. "That is why he asked you to come this morning." Maya nodded slightly, but did not respond right away. She was still trying to understand why a powerful business leader would invite someone like her into a place like this. After a few moments, the elevator stopped at one of the highest floors in the building. The doors opened to reveal a quiet hallway lined with large windows that overlooked the skyline of New York City. Sunlight poured across the polished floor while the distant shapes of skyscrapers stretched toward the horizon. Sophia guided Maya down the hallway toward a large office door at the end. When Sophia opened the door, Maya stepped inside and paused in surprise. The office was enormous but simple. One wide desk faced the windows while several chairs surrounded a long conference table. Alexander Hayes stood near the window looking out across the city as if he had been thinking for a long time. When he heard them enter, he turned and offered Maya a calm nod of greeting. "Thank you for coming, Maya Collins," he said. Sophia gave a respectful nod and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Maya remained near the entrance for a moment, unsure where to stand. Alexander gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Please sit down. Maya walked forward and sat carefully while keeping her hands folded together. Alexander returned to his desk and sat across from her. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Alexander leaned forward slightly. I thought about our conversation last night, he said. Especially your idea about creating a kitchen and shelter. Maya looked up at him with cautious curiosity. I meant what I said, she replied. People need a place that gives them stability, not just temporary help. Alexander nodded slowly. That is exactly why I asked you here. He opened a folder on the desk and slid several photographs across the table toward her. Maya leaned forward and studied the images. They showed an empty warehouse building located in an older part of the city. The structure looked worn but large enough to hold many rooms. This building belongs to one of my development companies, Alexander explained. It has been in use for several years while we decided what to do with the property. Maya studied the photographs more closely. You were thinking about turning this into the kitchen and shelter I mentioned. Alexander watched her reaction carefully. That depends on you, he answered. Maya blinked in surprise. On me. Alexander nodded once. You understand the needs of the people who would use it better than anyone working in this building. I want to know how you would design it. Maya felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty rise inside her chest. I am not an architect or a business manager, she said honestly. Alexander gave a faint smile. You are someone who knows what survival looks like. That knowledge is far more valuable than any degree when designing a place meant to help people rebuild their lives. Maya looked again at the photographs of the warehouse. She imagined cooking stations along one wall, tables where people could eat warm meals, and small rooms where families could sleep safely at night. Slowly the idea that had started as a simple thought in the shelter began to take shape in her mind. Alexander studied her expression and saw the change happen. That is the look I was hoping to see, he said quietly. Maya lifted her eyes from the photographs. You are serious about this, she said. Alexander leaned back in his chair and folded his hands calmly. Completely serious. But before we move forward, there is something you should understand. Maya waited for him to continue. Alexander spoke carefully. If we build this project together, you will not just be someone receiving help. You will become responsible for helping many others. Maya sat silently for a moment while the weight of his words settled around her. Then she looked directly at him and answered with quiet determination. That is exactly what I want. For several seconds after Maya Collins said those words, the office remained quiet except for the faint sound of traffic far below the glass windows. Alexander Hayes watched her carefully, measuring the confidence in her voice. In the world he had built, many people spoke about helping others, but very few spoke with the calm certainty Maya carried in that moment. She was not chasing recognition or a salary. She was focused on solving a problem she had lived through. Alexander slowly closed the folder of photographs and leaned back in his chair. That is good to hear, he said, because responsibility is exactly what this project will require. Maya remained seated but leaned slightly forward with curiosity. Alexander turned his computer monitor so she could see it. A large blueprint of the warehouse building appeared on the screen. The structure covered nearly an entire city block, with wide open interior space that had once been used for manufacturing equipment. I had my development team examine this property earlier this morning, Alexander explained. It can be renovated into a community kitchen, sleeping quarters, medical rooms, and job training spaces. Maya studied the blueprint with growing interest. Her eyes moved slowly across the layout as if she could already see the future building in her mind. The kitchen should be near the entrance, she said after a moment. People need to feel welcome the moment they walk in. Alexander nodded and watched her continue. The sleeping area should not be one large room, Maya added. Families need privacy, even if the rooms are small. And there should be a quiet space where people can talk to counselors or social workers. Alexander listened without interrupting. Every suggestion she made came from experience rather than theory. The ideas were simple but practical, shaped by someone who had lived through the reality of sleeping on concrete floors and waiting in long food lines. After several minutes, Alexander folded his arms thoughtfully. Maya, you just described the basic structure of a recovery center, he said. Maya looked up at him. Recovery center. Alexander nodded. A place where people receive more than food and a bed. A place where they regain the ability to rebuild their lives. Maya considered the phrase for a moment before speaking again. That is exactly what it should be. For a brief moment Alexander allowed himself a small smile. Then his expression became serious again. There is something else you should know before we move forward. Maya waited quietly. Alexander stood from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. From this height the streets below looked small and distant. When you work in a position like mine, he said slowly, every decision is examined by investors, journalists, and competitors. Maya tilted her head slightly, not fully understanding where he was going. Alexander turned back toward her. If I move forward with a project like this, people will ask questions. Some will support it. Others will criticize it. Maya frowned slightly. Criticize helping people. Alexander gave a small nod. In business nothing is ever that simple. Some will say I am wasting company resources. Others will claim I am using charity to improve my public image. Maya looked down at the blueprint again and then back at Alexander. Does that matter to you? Alexander held her gaze calmly. It matters only if the project fails to accomplish its purpose. Maya stood from her chair slowly and walked closer to the screen showing the building plans. She traced one of the empty sections of the blueprint with her finger. If the place works, if people find jobs again and families stop sleeping on the streets, then the criticism does not matter. Alexander watched her carefully. Her answer came without hesitation. For the second time since meeting her, he felt that quiet respect return. He stepped closer and spoke in a firm voice. Then let us make sure it works. Maya turned to face him fully. Alexander continued speaking with a new sense of purpose. Construction on the warehouse could begin within a few weeks. But a project like this needs someone who understands the people it is meant to serve. Maya felt a sudden realization forming in her mind. You want me to run it? She said slowly. Alexander nodded once. I want you to help design it, guide it, and protect its mission. Maya looked at the blueprints one more time before meeting his eyes again. The responsibility he described was enormous, far greater than anything she had ever imagined holding. Yet instead of fear, she felt determination growing stronger inside her chest. Then we should start planning today, she said. Alexander Hayes gave a quiet, approving nod, realizing that the test he had started with a single black card had just led to something far more powerful than he ever expected. The rest of the morning inside the office of Alexander Hayes passed faster than Maya Collins expected. Papers spread across the wide conference table as architects, project managers, and advisors joined the meeting one after another. At first Maya felt completely out of place among the neatly dressed professionals discussing construction timelines and city permits. Their language was filled with technical terms about infrastructure, zoning approval, and supply chains. Yet whenever the conversation turned toward the people the building was meant to serve, all eyes quietly shifted toward her. Maya slowly began to speak more often, explaining how shelters failed when they felt like temporary holding rooms instead of places where dignity could return. She described how long food lines created frustration and how privacy gave families the confidence to begin rebuilding their lives again. The professionals in the room listened with increasing attention, some taking notes while others asked questions. Alexander remained seated near the end of the table, watching the discussion unfold with calm satisfaction. He noticed that every time Maya described a problem, she also offered a practical solution shaped by experience. After nearly 2 hours, the meeting finally ended. The architects gathered their documents while the project managers discussed early renovation schedules. Within a few weeks, the empty warehouse could begin transforming into the recovery center Maya had imagined the night before. When the room gradually cleared, Maya remained seated for a moment staring at the blueprints still spread across the table. The quiet suddenly felt overwhelming after so many voices had filled the space. Alexander walked back into the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one gently in front of Maya before sitting across from her again. You handled that meeting better than most executives I work with, he said. Maya gave a small, uncertain laugh. I was just explaining what life is like out there. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. That is exactly why your perspective matters. Maya took a careful sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander looked toward the window overlooking the city. Something interesting is about to happen once this project becomes public, he said calmly. Maya looked up. What do you mean? Alexander turned back toward her. News travels quickly when a large development company starts renovating a building in the middle of the city. Journalists will ask questions about why we are doing this. Maya nodded slowly. And you think they will criticize it? Some will, Alexander replied. But others may support it. Either way, the attention will come. Maya thought about the people still sleeping in the parking structure and the hundreds of others scattered throughout the city. If attention helps the project grow, then maybe that is a good thing, she said quietly. Alexander studied her face for a moment before responding. You are not worried about the attention. Maya shook her head gently. I have already lived through the worst kind of attention a person can receive. When you are homeless, everyone sees you, but no one truly looks at you. Alexander considered her words carefully. The honesty in them carried more weight than any speech given in a corporate boardroom. He leaned forward slightly and spoke with quiet seriousness. Then there is something I should show you. Maya watched as he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out the same black card he had given her the night before. He placed it on the table between them. Maya looked at it with a faint smile of recognition. I thought you said I could keep that. Alexander nodded. You still can. But I want it to mean something different now. Maya raised an eyebrow slightly. Different how? Alexander slid the card closer to her. Last night this card was a test. Today it represents a responsibility. The funding for the recovery center will come from several company sources, but this card will remain connected to the project. Maya studied the card for a moment before meeting his eyes again. You are trusting me with it again. Alexander nodded once. Because yesterday you proved that money in the hands of the right person can create opportunity instead of greed. Maya slowly picked up the card and held it carefully between her fingers. The weight felt familiar, yet the meaning behind it had changed completely. Alexander stood and walked toward the window once more while speaking in a thoughtful voice. A single decision on a subway bench last night revealed something rare, Maya Collins. Maya looked up from the card. What was that? Alexander turned back toward her with a calm expression. A leader who understands people long before she understands power. For a long moment after Alexander Hayes spoke those words, Maya Collins remained seated in the quiet office, holding the black card in her hand, as if it carried the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. Only the day before she had been sitting on a cold subway bench wondering where she would sleep that night. Now she was looking out through the glass wall of a skyscraper at the wide skyline of New York City, while holding responsibility for a project that could change hundreds of lives. The contrast felt almost unreal. Alexander returned to the conference table and gathered the remaining blueprints before sliding one final document toward her. Maya glanced down at it with curiosity. It was not another architectural drawing. Instead, it was a preliminary timeline for the renovation project. The document described the next several months in careful detail. Demolition would begin within 2 weeks. Construction teams would rebuild the interior walls soon after. Kitchens, dormitory rooms, and medical offices would follow. If everything moved according to schedule, the recovery center could open its doors before the first cold nights of winter returned to the city. Maya slowly read through the pages while absorbing the reality of what they were building together. When she finished, she looked up at Alexander with quiet determination. We need to make sure the people currently living in temporary shelters know this place is coming, she said. Many of them have stopped trusting promises. Alexander nodded in agreement. Trust must be earned, he replied. Maya placed the document back on the table. Then the first step should be talking to them directly. Alexander studied her expression. You want to return to the parking structure and the other shelters. Maya nodded firmly. If this center is going to belong to the community needs to know it exists before the doors even open. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. I expected you to say that. Maya looked at him with mild curiosity. Why? Alexander smiled faintly. Because every decision you make begins with the same question. Who else needs to be included? Maya gave a small shrug. That is the only way this works. Alexander stood and walked toward the window once more. From this height, the city stretched endlessly in every direction. Millions of lives were moving through the streets below, each one carrying its own story of success, struggle, or survival. When he turned back toward Maya, his voice carried a sense of quiet respect. Very few people ever see the city from both sides, he said. Maya raised an eyebrow slightly. Both sides. Alexander nodded. The side where power and opportunity are concentrated in buildings like this. and the side where people sleep under bridges and inside abandoned structures just to survive the night. Maya looked down briefly before answering. I wish I had never seen that second side. Alexander spoke gently. But because you did, you understand what many leaders forget. Maya looked back up at him. And what is that? Alexander walked back to the table and placed one hand lightly on the blueprint. That real change begins with listening to people who have lived the problem themselves. Maya considered his words for a moment before picking up the black card again. She turned it slowly between her fingers, remembering the moment it had first been placed in her hand. Yesterday this card tested my character, she said quietly. Alexander watched her carefully. And today? Maya looked directly at him. Today it reminds me that every decision I make now affects more than just my own life. Alexander gave a slow nod of approval. That realization is exactly why I believe you are the right person for this project. Maya stood from her chair and looked once more at the plans for the recovery center spread across the table. For the first time she could clearly imagine the building filled with people cooking meals, families sleeping safely in warm rooms, and workers helping others rebuild their lives step by step. She took a deep breath and slipped the black card carefully into her coat pocket again. Then we should begin telling people what is coming, she said. Alexander walked toward the door and opened it. Sophia Grant was already waiting outside with several documents prepared for the next phase of planning. As Maya stepped into the hallway beside them, she realized something remarkable. The test that had begun with a single black card had not only revealed her character. It had opened the door to a future where compassion could become a system powerful enough to change an entire community. 6 months passed faster than Maya Collins ever imagined. The abandoned warehouse that once stood silent and forgotten slowly transformed into something entirely different. Construction crews worked through long days and cold mornings, rebuilding walls, installing large kitchen equipment, and dividing the interior into smaller living spaces where families could finally rest in privacy and safety. What had once been an empty shell of concrete gradually became a place filled with light, warmth, and purpose. Throughout those months Maya returned often to the old parking structure where everything had begun. She spoke with the people living there and in other shelters across the city, explaining the recovery center that was being built and inviting them to help shape the programs it would offer. At first many people were skeptical. They had heard promises. Before that never became reality. But as the weeks passed and the construction site began to rise from the ground with visible progress, hope slowly replaced doubt. Victor was one of the first to volunteer when Maya asked for help organizing the kitchen. His health had improved after receiving steady medicine and proper meals. Elena and her child moved into a temporary apartment arranged through the project while waiting for the center to open. Many others who had once slept on cold sidewalks began participating in training programs designed to help them find work again. The morning the building officially opened arrived on a clear autumn day. A small crowd gathered outside the entrance of the new recovery center. Journalists, community volunteers, city officials, and people from nearby shelters stood together beneath a simple sign placed above the door. The name of the building was written in clear letters. The Open Hands Recovery Center. Maya stood near the entrance wearing a simple coat, watching as the doors were prepared for the first official visitors. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the large kitchen inside, where volunteers were already preparing meals. Families would soon move into the small dormitory rooms upstairs. Counselors and job training advisors waited in newly furnished offices. Everything that had once existed only as a conversation around a blueprint now stood ready to serve the community. Alexander Hayes stood beside Maya while observing the crowd quietly. Several reporters had already approached him earlier that morning asking why a powerful development company had invested so heavily in a project focused on helping homeless families rebuild their lives. Alexander had answered each question simply, "Because someone showed me what leadership really looks like." Maya glanced at him with a small smile when she heard those words repeated by one of the journalists. When the time came to open the doors, Alexander stepped aside and gestured toward her. "This began with you," he said quietly. Maya shook her head gently. "It began with a test you gave a stranger on a subway bench." Alexander gave a thoughtful nod. "And that stranger passed the test in a way I never expected." Maya looked at the black card resting safely inside her coat pocket. For months she had carried it as a reminder of how quickly life could change when someone chose kindness over fear. She stepped forward and opened the doors of the recovery center. People slowly began walking inside, some with cautious curiosity and others with visible relief. Victor entered the kitchen area with a proud smile as he joined the volunteers preparing meals. Elena carried her child through the hallway toward the new living rooms upstairs. The once silent warehouse was now filled with voices, movement, and hope. Alexander stood near the entrance watching the scene unfold. After a moment, Maya joined him again and looked across the busy room. "You were right about one thing," she said softly. Alexander turned slightly toward her. "What was that?" Maya smiled as she watched people sharing food at the long tables. "Money does not create character. It only reveals it." Alexander nodded slowly, realizing that the greatest investment he had ever made was not in a building or a company. It had been in the quiet courage of a young woman who chose to help others before helping herself.